Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session in American English Live Series 21. I am Dr. Darlene Wiggins Dockery, and I will be your host today, along with my colleague behind the scenes, Elena, who will be serving as our moderator, answering your questions and responding to your comments in the chat. We wanted to let you know that today's session will be recorded and shared across various platforms. By attending and adding your comments to the chat or comments during today's webinar, your first name, your country, and or your comment may be included in the video recording. By participating, you consent to your appearance in the recording and its use for purposes related to the work of FHI 360 and the U.S. Department of State. If you do not want to appear in the recording, please do not share any comments in the chat or comments box during the webinar. So, throughout Series 21, we are exploring a variety of strategies for building academic skills for success and assessment in the English language classroom. We hope you'll be able to use these practical strategies that we share. So, what can you expect today? The session is about 60 minutes long. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. But really, we want to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas and experiences. Please share your thoughts in the comments feature or the chat box. After our session comes to a close, you will have the opportunity to receive a digital badge for your participation. At the end of the webinar, we'll share a link in the comments. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of the 3 multiple choice questions correctly in order to receive the badge. So if you successfully pass the quiz on your first try, you can expect to get your badge via email in about a week. And before we get started, we wanted to let you know about one of our current massive open online courses, or MOOCs, fostering student motivation and engagement. In this free MOOC, participants will learn key concepts and practices related to motivation and engagement, including community building, differentiated instruction, formative assessment, project-based learning, metacognition, and more. This course is open now, and enrollment closes on December 23rd. So please use the link being shared by our moderator in the chat to learn more and to enroll today. Now for today's webinar, Scaffolding for Academic Writing. This webinar will model and explore a 4-part interactive teaching and learning cycle that can strengthen students' emerging academic writing skills. Together, we will review key teaching and learning cycle components, including background building, text modeling, joint construction, and independent construction. We'll then examine effective activities that build background knowledge and consider a systematic process for highlighting key language to students. By the end of the session, we'll be able to describe key features of effective joint construction activities. And we are pleased to introduce our presenter, Hetal Ascher. For more than 10 years, Hetal has served multilingual learners as a professional learning specialist, teacher, and program coordinator. She holds an MA in ESL education and a BA in ESL education, K 12. And she is currently pursuing a PhD in curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin. Hetal has volunteered with professional organizations such as TESOL International Association in various capacities, including chairing a professional council and writing regular posts for the TESOL blog. She is the incoming chair of TESOL's Reading and Vocabulary Interest section. Welcome, Hetal.
Thank you so much. I hope all of you are having a wonderful day. Welcome to our webinar today called Scaffolding for Academic Writing. So the first thing we'll do is look at some of the goals for today's webinar. Our first goal for this webinar is to talk about the importance of scaffolding for academic writing. And our second goal, where we'll spend most of our time, is to look at each phase of the teaching and learning cycle and how we would implement that phase in a classroom. So let's look at this. What is academic writing? So when I say academic writing, I'm talking about the formal writing style that we often expect students to produce in school. It's also the writing style we might expect from students in universities and people in professional contexts. And this type of language is usually more formal because we don't know the audience personally, and it requires more complex language than everyday writing. And scaffolding means that we provide support for students to achieve the goal. And students need this support or scaffolding because academic writing is challenging, but it's also so important. And it's not something that students usually can just pick up from their daily lives. So it requires some direct teaching from us. All right, so now that we've talked about the importance of scaffolding for academic writing, we're going to dive into the teaching and learning cycle. So the teaching and learning cycle is a 4-part cycle, and it emphasizes teaching students the genre or the type of text. And it supports students to build control of their language through explicit teaching and practice. And you can use it anytime you're asking students to write an academic text, like a formal email or any type of essay or the text you mentioned in the activity at the start of this webinar. All right, let's look at an overview of the teaching and learning cycle. So the teaching and learning cycle has 4 phases. The first phase is building background knowledge, where we talk about where we build the students' topic knowledge so that they understand what they'll write about. The second phase is modeling the text, and this is where we use a sample text or multiple sample text to show students what we expect from their writing. The third phase is joint construction, and in this phase, we lead students through some collaborative writing so that they get to practice what we expect. And finally is independent construction or individual construction, and this is where students are now more prepared to write on their own. And this is a cycle. There is no set order. You might choose to move backwards as you notice your students need more practice with a different phase. But in this workshop, we'll start at building background and move through the cycle. So starting with building background, again, this is where we focus on making sure the students have knowledge about the topic, because learners need to know about a topic to be able to write about it. You can't write about something that you don't know about. It also is a great place to give students opportunities to connect to and build on what they know, because connecting to what we know is how new learning sticks in our mind. So it's important for our students to have time to make these connections as well. And good building background activities are also multimodal. And this just means that we include a variety of ways to understand the message. For example, we might use pictures and videos to support text or something we can move around with our hands. Next, I want to introduce you to an activity that is great for building background knowledge. And there are many great activities, but we'll do one example together. And this activity is called Inquiry Activator. So the first step is to place visuals around the room. And when I would do this in my own middle school classroom, I would post pictures, and sometimes I would include little articles or social media posts or even videos and graphs, because the more interesting the visuals are to your students, the better the lesson will be. Step two is to ask students to walk around the room and leave note by the visuals of what they notice. And in the third step, we want students to share what they notice, and you can provide sentence stems like I notice or I wonder or whatever you're working on in class. You can change those to make it fit for you. All right, are you ready to try this? So imagine that I'm your middle school English teacher. I want you all to write essays persuading an audience to do something to protect the forest. And now in my class, I had to pick this topic and this writing task because that was my curriculum. So toward the beginning of the unit, I might do an activity like this, Inquiry Activator. So in front of you, there are two visuals of a forest. I would like you to type in the chat box, what do you notice or what do you wonder about these pictures?
Okay, so while we wait for your responses, what do you notice or wonder about these pictures? Mm, I think if I jumped in, I would wonder um, if it's the same space. I noticed that the one on the left is clean and beautiful. I wonder if this is a different point in time. So let's see what some of our participants wonder or notice. Okay, so we heard from Zarki, Zarchi, who said deforestation. Wafa said global warming. So I'm thinking I notice would be the frames for these. I wonder, Sarah wants to know, why are the trees being cut? Makara says, I notice green forest versus deforestation process causing damage. And Hamad said, I wonder when I would be going to these places. So, and one more, Alfara said, I wonder where are those places? So back to you, Hetal.
Thank you. Thank you all for engaging in that activity. That time gave you a chance and gives our students a chance to connect to their own curiosity about a topic and what they already know about a topic. All right, so when you do an activity like this, you might consider some different ways to support your students with vocabulary, thinking about what words they might need to use to engage in this activity. So, for example, before this activity, I might make sure students know words like habitat, deforestation, and extinct. Then during the activity, students have the chance to use the word in their own way. And then when you do an activity like this, you can think about how you might want to keep some of these ideas. Um, you can ask students to keep those ideas themselves. You might also gather all the ideas in one place so that you can come back to it as a class afterwards. But depending on your students, you can decide how you want to keep the vocabulary. And it can be helpful to maybe post some of these things around the room if you have that space to do that. All right. So thinking about multimodal activities, and again, those are activities where you can use different senses like see pictures, watch videos, move something around. Um, what are some other multimodal activities you can do to help your students build background knowledge or build more knowledge about the topic that they're going to write about?
Hmm. So, what are other multimodal activities you can do to help your students build their background knowledge? Mm, Conversations. Those are some multimodal activities, in that they can have a conversation with their parents or other people close to them to find out more about the topic or to begin to think about the topic in other ways. Let's see what some of the other strategies that our participants um, are sharing with us. Joelma says, read a text with keywords. Rosetta said, research word search. Selmy said, short films. I love filmography. That is such a good way to begin conversation. Imar says, discussion. Koret says, I will give them charts to discuss and then write down points. And Javed said, bingo sheets. And finally, Gabri says, we could ask them to write questions about the photos. So those are some of the multimodal suggestions from our participants. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. So now that we've finished background building, the next phase of the teaching and learning cycle that we'll look at together is called modeling the text. And in this phase, the teacher and the students look at an example text together, and we clearly show students the type of writing we notice and what we expect, language we might expect for the type of text we're teaching. So um, as teachers, we can support our students by modeling the writing expectations in a sample writing piece. So to be able to do that, you would want to think about how to get a sample text. You might write one yourself. If you work with the curriculum, maybe you have one already. Uh, Otherwise, you might look for one. And during this phase, you'll need to think about what the target language is that you want your students to learn. So you need to choose a few language structures that you will point out to students to notice together. So there are some materials you might need. These are just some ideas. You'll definitely need a sample text, and you might want something that the students can annotate. So if you can print it out or they can write the text down in their books, um, those are just some ideas of what you might need. So let's look at an example together. This is a very simple example. So I want you to carefully look at this sign. You can look at the pictures, you can notice the language used. With my own students, I would start with a simple example like this, just to get them thinking about the type of text we're writing. So I would look at this sign. And again, remember, we're working on persuasive writing. We're working on how an author convinces an audience to do something. So I would show the students this sign and first ask, I wonder why the author wrote this. And actually, I'm going to ask Darlene what she thinks. Darlene, why do you think the author made this sign?
It looks like the author is trying to warn people about some dangerous waves on this particular beach. So I think that's why.
Yeah. And if I were teaching, I might push students further. I might say, how do you know? But that's a great answer. And it's clear from the author's simple words like warning, right? Let's look at the second question. So, who is the author's audience? And how do you think that might affect the author's language choices?
Well, I'm seeing more than one language. So I think tourist, maybe, this beach must have people from other places that come. So they put the warning in two languages. So I would think tourist and locals. And then I'm thinking, of course, people who go to the beach would be the audience.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Darlene. And I think that it's also really important to notice the visual here with your students because visuals can be such powerful tools for communicating messages.
Mhm.
So I would ask my students, let's look at that visual. What does that show us? And why did the author do that? Um, so these are great conversations that you might have with your students before you jump into a more academic text that you want your students to write, just to get them thinking about these ideas.
Mhm.
All right, so now I'd like to show you an example text from my own classroom. So I taught middle school, like I mentioned, and I'm required to teach persuasive essay writing on deforestation. So for the sake of time, we're going to jump right into the middle of this essay. So you'll have to just imagine that I did already teach students how to write an introduction. But I really wanted to look at the middle of the essay with you all today. So one important skill for me to teach my students is to teach them how to organize paragraphs. And that means looking at topic sentences and details. So if I were teaching this, I would provide a copy of this text to my students or maybe ask them to copy the example text. Um, so then I would do something like this after they have the text. I would read the first sentence. One major problem caused by deforestation is the loss of animal habitat. Then I would ask my students, what does the sentence tell us? So I would say something like, this sentence tells us that this paragraph is going to be all about the loss of animal habitats. Let's read the next sentences and see if I'm right. Let's see if all the next sentences are details about the loss of habitats. Then I would read through the rest of them like this. Many animals, such as birds and squirrels, live in the trees and need them for food and shelter. Is that about animal habitats? I'd ask my students. And they might say yes, they might not. And depending on what they say, I would need to help them understand that yes, this is a detail about a loss of animal habitat. Um, and then I would go through each sentence so they understand the structure of topic sentence and detail sentences and examples. And then I might think about one language feature, one key language, one way the author uses language that I want my students to do as well. So I might point out to the students, this topic sentence we have here, it's all about animal habitats. But the writer doesn't just repeat the word animal habitats in every single sentence. They name that subject in many different ways. So I might say, let's look at that together. We might look at the first sentence. Many animals, such as birds and squirrels, live in the trees and need them for food and shelter. So I might say, did you notice any animal habitats there? Um, and hopefully they would notice that in the trees is actually an example of an animal habitat. And then we could connect that idea that the trees is the habitat and them is referring to the trees. And this can make the writing style a lot more clear for the students. And then I would go through when the forest is cut down, these animals lose their homes and may have trouble finding food. So again, the author didn't say animal habitat. They talked about the forest instead and homes, animal homes instead of animal habitat, right? Uh, and looking at the next sentence, when wild animals do not have a place to live, they can become endangered or even extinct. And here again, we've used place to live instead of animal habitat. For example, the red panda has lost much of his habitat due to deforestation and is now endangered. All right. Thank you for looking at this example with me. And I just also want to mention that this can be over a few lessons. It doesn't have to be all together at one time. I want to model another example of language you might focus on. This one is more grammatical, but I'm not teaching it in a traditional way. I want to teach using complex sentences in the way that somebody might actually use them. So I want students to see this example. I might tell them, the writer here uses complex sentences to show cause and effect. Then we'll go through the same paragraph again and look at the author's use of complex sentences. And we might look at this sentence first. As the forest is cut down, these animals lose their homes and may have trouble finding food. Right? That's our complex sentence. It shows cause and effect. It shows that when the forest is cut down, what happens to the animals? We also see when wild animals do not have a place to live, they can become endangered or even extinct. And so in this way, we model this language to the students, show them an example. And when you do this modeling, it's also very important to save this language that you just pointed out to the students so that they can see them and use these resources for their writing in the future. So in my classroom, I always wrote these sentences just in the corner of a board so that the students could look there if they wanted to use this sentence structure later. I knew other teachers that kept a notebook, that each student had a notebook and they asked their students to keep the notebook with these sentence frames. Or you might even use a Google Doc to save the language or some kind of online way. Whatever you do, it's up to you and what works best for you and your class. But the most important thing is that students keep these notes so that they can use them later and they know where they are, so they know how to use them later. Um, all right, let's pause here for a little bit of reflection. I am wondering what you think now about what are the benefits of spending time focusing on the language in an example text.
Okay, so let us hear from you. What do you think are the benefits of spending time focusing on the language in an example text? I know you all have some ideas to share with us and with each other. So let's see. We've heard from Mansour, and Mansour said, this is a great way to avoid repetition in writing. We also have a comment from Ramato who said, pictures are used to stimulate and motivate learners in the classroom setting. Michael said, when introducing model text to students, it's helpful to explore different ways to name or describe the subject of the text. This can enhance their understanding and vocabulary, as well as their ability to analyze and discuss the content. Here are several strategies for naming the subject in different ways. So I hope you all will look in the chat and see Michael's examples. We also heard from Nimra, who said, it's like critically analyzing a particular text. Rosetta said, the language benefits, it helps students to analyze and interpret a topic. And Elena said, to have learned the wording characteristic of academic writing. Cursos de Idiomas said, students become aware about more complex sentences and hopefully try to achieve more complex structures. Isra said it is very useful to highlight sentences. Anu said it greatly helps students to write their own writings with more enthusiasm. Lena said to think about our own writing in every detail. Back to you, Hetal. Those are some really delightful responses. Thank you.
Those are some wonderful responses. And you all are right that this helps students analyze the text. It helps them understand the text. And that really supports students with being able to write the text, write their own text later. So thank you so much. Um, Next, we're going to look at the third step called joint construction. And in this phase, students and teachers work together to write a text. And you work together with the students' ideas to write the text, and the teacher guides and prompts, but they do not fully control the process like they did in the modeling the text, where they knew what language they were pointing out, right? Um, so what I've noticed in classrooms and in my own classroom when I started is that we'll do some of these things, like we'll build background knowledge, we'll show examples. Sometimes we might even explicitly teach that language, but then after we've done that, we just ask
Bit of
students,
technical
okay,
difficulty, Hetal. So if you
oh,
don't mind repeating that, you were frozen for a moment.
oh, I'm so sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Am I okay now?
Yes, you are. You are.
Okay. I was saying, so I've noticed that in classrooms, even my classroom when I was starting out as a teacher, that we might do some of these things, like build some content knowledge, we might show examples, we might teach some language, but then we ask students to jump across to a final product. Oh, now it's your turn to write. And it's like asking students to jump across a river on rocks like this. Some might make it successfully, but others might not be able to make it across. They might fall in, they might get wet. They need support, they need our help to get to the other side. So in this phase, I like us to imagine it as we're building a bridge from the model text, the example text we just looked at, to independent writing. This really supports students to get from the last step to their own writing. And in my own classroom, I've found this space to be such a great place for learning, where students really felt like, oh, I'm learning this, I can do it on my own later. Um, and it requires a teacher's direction. It requires a knowledge from you about what you want at the end, but it also requires the students to be very engaged and to give their own ideas about making the text. That's why it's called joint construction, because we build this text together jointly with our students. All right, let's jump into it. So when you're doing joint construction in your classroom, you want to put your students in pairs or small groups. And I like this so the students can have a chance to talk to one another about their ideas before they share them with the whole class, because that can be a little scary sometimes. Um, then you want to tell the students what we're doing, set the activity rules or norms. For example, you might tell the students, we're all sharing our ideas, and we're going to accept everyone's ideas. We're not going to judge each other's ideas. All right. Then you want to lead the students through their main argument or main idea or key details, whatever text you're working on, right? You want to lead the students through thinking about what they might say. And then you want to, as you go, give students time to think about what they might say, to write their example sentences. So in my example, I would want to give them time to draft a topic sentence or draft some supporting sentences. Um, and then you want to ask students to share their ideas with the class. And then as the teacher, you pick an idea and you do your best to accept their ideas, to take whatever they say, and you want to write their idea on the board and you are constructing a text, an example text like a model text, but with your students' ideas. Um, and then at the end, you have a little text where you and your class made this together. And it's important to prompt students to remember language that they studied. So you might ask students who can use their notes to think of a good connecting word to connect these ideas, or who can look at their sentence frames and put these ideas together into a sentence. But in this phase, you are not expecting perfection. We're not expecting this essay that you wrote together with your class or this text you wrote together to be perfect. We're not grading it. It's not for that purpose. It's still for learning. So if the students make mistakes, that's okay. You can write those mistakes on the board, and then you might correct them together. So you'll see in an example that we'll do now. All right. So to show you this, Darlene and I will do a demonstration. So I will be the teacher and Darlene will play a whole classroom full of students.
I'm the whole class. Okay. All
All right,
right. Here we go.
here we go. All right. So now you're imagining that I already have been teaching this for a little while. All right. So I might say, all right, class, let's move on to creating a topic sentence for our second supporting argument. So I'd like you now to turn to your partner, reread the previous paragraph, and brainstorm a first sentence for this paragraph. Remember to check your notes and examples to help you.
My partner and I have an idea. What if we say another major problem caused by deforestation is climate change?
Thank you, Darlene. That's a wonderful start. I'll write that on the board, and you all can write it in your notebook. All right. Is there anything anyone else wants to add or to change about this sentence? And then I would give students a little time to think here about what they might add or change.
I was thinking, I'm another student now since I'm the whole classroom. I was thinking we used the word deforestation in the previous sentence. I checked my notes for other words for deforestation. Maybe for this sentence, we could say forest destruction.
Great job using your notes. All right, class, do we agree with that idea? All right, let's make that change together. And then I would cross out deforestation, I would write forest destruction, and I would expect all my students to do the same. All right, that was just a very small snapshot of what that would look like, where you take your students' ideas and put it together into one classroom text. All right, so let's stop and reflect here. I'd like you to think about how you might use joint construction in your classroom. And go ahead and share your ideas.
Hmm. While we're waiting for those ideas to come in, I was just thinking I taught an English for Business and Entrepreneurship course a few years ago. And this could be a wonderful way to construct an email together, a business related email with the participants in one's class. Um, and then we have a question again while we're waiting for responses. Tareem said, would you suggest to use these activities for university students? That's question one. Question two, how can we appropriate these activities to sit well with adult learners as well?
Those are great questions. I definitely think you can do this together with adult learners. I think that the difference is maybe in the style. You might ask, you could even do this process with students, your adult students in small group. Maybe if they need to write a formal email, they could write it together with a partner and jointly construct the text together with a partner, where you offer some input. Um, because this strategy, it really works anytime you want people to write a text together, or anytime you want people to write a particular type of text. You're showing them how to do it.
Thank you so much. Um, we are getting some responses on our reflection question. How might you use joint construction in your classroom? We heard from Doris, who said to write a blog, essay, or paragraph. We also heard from Tima, who said after each chapter, we could use this technique. Samia said, I create stories this way. Sartag said through brainstorming or mind mapping. Maram, please pardon me if I butchered your name, said match sentences with linkers and organize them. Fran said assigning each group of students a topic to write a paragraph related to the main topic of an essay. And then we heard from Somia, who said, students take story ahead through adding to it. My students find this very interesting. Sataraj said, mostly as a sentence starter is given to the students. Victoria said, use tools like Google Docs to facilitate joint construction online. Students can collaborate in real time, allowing them to contribute to the writing process even outside of the classroom. And JG said, in collaborative writing, group discussions and problem solving and interactive group organizers are some ways that you might use joint construction in your classroom. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to some of the ideas about, especially for teaching older students or university students. I would say one tip is to not try to jointly construct a giant essay, because sometimes university students need to write very long text. You can still just do it with one paragraph, or something small, just especially if you're just starting out with this strategy. Um,
Mhm.
and that will help you and help your students. And I'll say when I started with this strategy, um, I found it very challenging because I taught middle school, and you really cannot predict what a student that age will
Mhm.
say. So the first time I tried it, I was doing my best to accept student ideas, and we ended up writing an essay together as a class that wasn't very good, was not very high quality. Um, However, it was a great learning experience for me to see where my students actually were, and then we could go back and I could reteach a little bit. And we went back to that text and we worked on it together again. And it was such a good experience for me because I was getting frustrated. Like, why aren't they doing what I told them to do in their final essays? And this
Mhm.
strategy helped me really understand where they were and how I could support them, or scaffold, how I could help them to get to that final text that I wanted them to be able to achieve or write by themselves.
Wow.
All right. So after we've done joint construction, we can arrive to the independent construction phase, really well prepared with knowledge and language to write independently. But I do want to say that although this phase is called individual or independent construction, it's good to think of it as building independence, because some students might still need support depending on your students and depending on how much you've been teaching this topic. They might still need support. So there are a few things that are important during independent construction that are worth thinking about. So You might think about how to work in time for self-reflection, especially for those of you who teach older students. That's really important for students to really stop, evaluate their own writing, or with a peer, with another classmate, read each other's writing and give some feedback um, to help each other before they produce a final writing piece. And then once it's ready, at any age, I recommend doing something to publish the writing, something that students can publicly share their work. So what I would do in the class is I would ask for some volunteers to share their work, to read their essay out loud to their classmates, or sometimes I would post their essays just on the wall so they could walk around and read it. But it's important to celebrate all the hard work students did and make it public. Um, and you might find your own ways to celebrate your students' ideas too, based on what works for your students, what your students would appreciate. All right, so now to recap or review the teaching and learning cycle. So we have 4 phases. We have build background, and that's where we spend time helping students understand the topic. Uh, and again, this is a cycle. You might come back to this um, building understanding about the topic. You might come back to that anytime. Uh, then we model the text. So that's where we look at an example piece of writing. We look at who is the author writing to? How is the text organized? Um, and we really point out the language that we want our students to focus on. Then we do joint construction, where we lead students through some collaborative writing, or maybe students collaborate with each other to do some writing. But we really build that bridge from the example text to independent or individual construction, where they might write their own text and get feedback from each other or from you before they finish writing their final text.
Hetal, I love how you pointed out that this is not necessarily going to be in an order and that you don't have to go back. I had this conversation just last night with my daughter that writing is an iterative process. You know, if you're going to go back and forth. So just don't feel upset if your first draft isn't perfect because it's probably not going to be. So thank you for this.
Absolutely. And that's why I put those arrows there, or that's why the arrows are there on the teaching and
Mm-hmm.
learning cycle to show that we go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
hmm All right. Thank you so much for all of your engagement today. It's been very amazing to hear all of your ideas. And to wrap up, I would love it if you would share a 3-word summary. So, in 3 words, can you summarize your takeaways from today's session?
In 3 words, can you summarize your takeaways from today's session? So does it need to be a sentence or can it be just 3 words that come to mind? What do
Can
you
be
have?
anything you want. It can be just 3 words, um,
Okay.
or a sentence if you want. Up to you.
Okay. Well, we talked about joint construction. So how about writing is collaborative? Writing is collaborative. That's 3 words.
I
Okay.
love that.
Okay. So let's see what our participants say. Okay. So okay. Oh, we heard from Wafa who said, "You are awesome." Those are the 3 words that came to mind.
Oh,
Thank you, Wafa. Um, Brenda said, support, build, share. Shoab said, great, informative session. Tanya said, amazing, useful, crucial. And while some of our other responses are coming in, I don't want to miss Rosetta's question to you, Hetal. She said, my question is it wise to have academic writing being taught in primary and secondary levels?
That's a good question. I I think so. In my experience, um, I taught middle school, but I had colleagues in elementary school, and they also worked on academic writing. It just might look different. What,
Hmm.
for example, a student in second grade might do for academic writing, maybe in science class, will look very different from a secondary student, but it's still academic writing because a student won't have that kind of writing experience in their daily life. And so it's still something that needs to be directly taught. And I think that's where the teaching and learning cycle is so powerful because it helps you to directly teach the type of writing you want your students to learn.
Okay, thank you for that. And Cesar's comment was with joint construction, students get hands-on experience. Now back to our three-word summaries. Okay, Sib 10 said understand, construct, generate. Merca said modeling, scaffolding, creativity. Shuram said practical, collaborative, modeling. Sergey said amazing writing skills. So those are the responses that we have. Oh, wait, there's one more. Fariha said creative, productive, practical. Thank you all so much for your comments.
Thank you all so much for this time together. I've really appreciated working with all of you today.
And thank you, Hetal, for sharing these wonderful interactive teaching and learning cycle and showing us how it can be used to strengthen the students' academic writing skills.